The Trump administration is lowering tariffs on Canadian groundwood paper used in newsprint production, giving limited relief to the U.S. newspaper industry. In January, the Commerce Department put a tax on those newsprint imports because of concerns the paper was subsidized by the Canadian government and sold at below market prices. But last week, the government decided to lower those tariffs from between 0 and 22% to between 0 and just over 16%. Before the tariff reductions were announced, I visited the New York Times printing plant to see how American newspapers were being affected. This is the stuff that is in the crosshairs of this debate on tariffs, this wood pulp.
Yes.
And it comes from Canada.
All of our newsprint comes from Canada.
Nearly 70% of newspapers in the U.S. rely on this, groundwood paper. Nick D'Andrea, the vice president of production at the New York Times, says the tariff has made printing on paper that much harder.
The newspapers have their own challenges already. Our job is to try to protect the revenue of the printed newspaper.
Ken Doctor, a news industry analyst, says the tariff is a blow to a print industry already in decline.
This is the kind of unexpected event that happens, and it takes an industry that may be hurting a little and makes it far worse.
As a result, small newsrooms have had to make tough choices, from laying off staff to cutting the number of pages they print.
And those tariffs have caused an increase in newsprint pricing of about 30 to 35%.
Beyond the tariffs, declining print readership overall has caused printing plants to make adjustments. At the New York Times printing plant in Queens, over 600,000 newspapers are rolled out every night, but not all copies are of the New York Times.
Capacity, and one of the things that we've done over the last couple of years is we try to bring more business in. So we've started printing USA Today here. Just recently we started printing Long Island Newsday here, and that's happening nationally, the consolidation.
So in response to declining print circulation, plants like yours are now printing for other newspapers, not just the Times.
Right.
In the last decade, weekday print newspaper circulation has dropped by over 30 million nationally.
The market for news and how people consume it has changed dramatically, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years.
In just 5 years as chief operating officer at the New York Times, Meredith Kopit-Levien has witnessed a 40% drop in subscribers to the Times daily print papers. It's called a newspaper.
Yeah.
But are we even going to have the paper part in 10 years?
The question is, will we have quality, original, independent journalism available to the masses in 10 years? And I think the answer is yes, but it requires that news organizations make digital experiences that are as addictive and unrivaled as the journalism itself.
Right. The Times readership is increasingly going digital. In just the last year, they've seen an increase of close to 1 million online subscribers. But not all papers have been able to pivot so successfully. Last week, the Daily News laid off half its staff, and in March, the Denver Post cut its newsroom by a third.
We are in a scary time for local journalism, and I think quality, original, independent journalism at the local level is like foundational to community, to society, and ultimately to democracy.
Joining us now via Skype from Milwaukee is Pat Henderson. He is the Director of Government Affairs at Quad Graphics, a commercial printing company that prints advertising inserts. He is also part of a coalition of printers, publishers, and newspaper suppliers fighting against tariffs on Canadian newsprint. Pat, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with how these tariffs began. They were imposed back in January of this year after a request by a paper mill in Washington state. But according to your group, this company is one of the only companies in the U.S. that actually wants these tariffs. Is that correct?
That's correct. They are the only company that seems to want these tariffs. In fact, not only is every other producer of paper against these tariffs, so are the we have some unions that are opposed to the tariffs as well, and AF&PA, the American Forest Products Association, that represents the paper makers, they're also opposed.
So if you have such a broad coalition of folks who are opposed to the tariffs, how is it that one company, NORPAC, was able to succeed in getting the administration to go forward with tariffs?
Well, early on, the administration made a decision based on who they were going to determine to be the domestic producers. And they said anybody that has operations on both sides of the border will not count as an American producer. And then that gave them the standing to come forward. And basically, NORPAC is the only producer at that point that was considered an American producer.
You've called the imposition of the tariffs a shock to the newspaper industry. In my reporting, it sounded like especially smaller and local papers are really on the front lines here, battling it out just in the war between digital and print. These tariffs could pose an existential threat to some of those publications. Does the lowering of the tariff cap help newspapers at this point?
Well, the narrowing is it's obviously a good thing to have it be lowered. Anything that we're going to do to try to help our newspapers and our customers stay in print is a good thing. But let's keep in mind, our customers, and in Quad, our customers are the folks that are printing the retail inserts, the advertising that are going into the newspaper.
Right.
But they do not have to be in print. There are mobile options, as you pointed out. And so any increased costs are going to drive people more and more to those digital options. And so lowering the tariff is obviously a welcome development, but it's only the first step. And what we need now is for the International Trade Commission to vote to eliminate the tariffs altogether.
I want to come back to that in a second, but just to explain to folks, print advertisement is a lifeline to a lot of these newspapers. So if you raise cost on paper, what you're saying is you're raising the cost for advertisers to print these inserts, meaning advertisers may just go digital, which means loss of revenue for smaller papers that are reliant on print advertising. Is that right?
Absolutely. It becomes a death spiral, a death spiral for those newspapers. Is they can't pass along the cost because passing on the cost will mean higher rates for the advertisers, and they'll look for other options. And so they have to eat those costs, which they can't afford to do. And so they'll decide to, well, how do we do it? We're going to shift to more digital options, or we're going to maybe go from a daily to a weekly.
Right.
Which then becomes an issue for our customers, as now even if they are willing to pay the higher price for the paper, now they're losing their delivery method and not hitting their customers as often, which is making it not as productive. And then they'll be looking to leave as well.
Pat, one of the newspaper representatives that I spoke with said you can't undo some of these cuts, which is to say newsrooms are already in a state of turmoil in terms of budgets. The layoffs that result, as some say, as a consequence of these tariffs are not going to be reversed just because if you look at the trajectory of print, it's not going back up. Do you think the same is true for advertising? Once you've gone digital, you won't go back to print?
I mean, you never want to say never, and certainly we hope that people will come back. But the damage has been done. We've already seen double-digit reductions in our print volumes since the tariffs been sort of fully realized in June and July. And those are customers that tend not to come back to us because it takes an investment to come back to print. You may have laid off the paper buyers and the layout, the folks that do the layouts, and the ad campaigns move on to a more digital focus. And it's then to get those folks back is a whole other commitment. And so in some respects, we are nervous that some of the damage has been done. But the hope is that those that stuck with us, we're not going to lose them going forward.
Pat Henderson, we'll be watching to see what the International Trade Commission does. It could undo this tariff at the end of the month. I know a lot of newspaper readers will be looking as well. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.